A lot of what Rufo wrote about was migration in Mexico. And Mexico has been a country for a long time that people have fled, much like the Caribbean region that we discussed last week. Some of this fleeing has taken place because of historical reasons. Number one, there's a lot of uneven development in Mexico. Just like everywhere else in Latin America, you have a small group of elite, wealthy landowners, and then you have a very large group of people who live in poverty, peasants or what are called campesinos. This has led at points to civil conflict and violence, the Mexican Revolution, for example. And if it wasn't because of inequality or conflict, people left because of economic reasons. One example is the Bracero program, when Mexican migrants moved from the country into the United States in 1942 to take over as farmhands. 4 million workers at that point crossed the U.S. border, and they established immigration networks and laid down the foundations for the Mexican-American population that we have today in many ways. This is an alien laborer's permit, quote unquote. You can see the text here at the top, and identification card, it says. It just gives you a sense for what these cards look like when people migrated. And people would oftentimes get into fairly long lines, as you can see here. They faced a lot of injustice, and some of the real ugly things that took place were the spraying of pesticides onto their items, their material possessions, and then onto their bodies as well. So you look back at this historically and it looks terrible. They also faced very difficult farm labor conditions, and they worked very long hours for fairly minimal pay, and they stayed in large dormitories like this. There were some cases of injustice, such as when farmers treated them medically through veterinarians, for example. So they faced a lot of injustice, and the Bracero program basically came about because in World War II, American farmhands left for war, and the United States needed laborers to come and do that kind of work. And the Bracero program, in another sense, underscores the fact that the United States has this relationship with Mexico where, there's criticism of migration, but oftentimes people in the United States are not acknowledging the contribution that Mexican migrants have made to the society here, and both culturally and economically. And we sort of have this schizophrenic relationship with migration where we appreciate the cultural contributions in some ways of people who migrate, but there seems to be this growing sentiment as we approach election year of people that are against migration, despite the fact that they're gaining a lot from migration itself. NAFTA has also been a driver of immigration from Mexico to the United States. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and at its core, it is neoliberal economic policy. Neoliberalism is a belief that free trade between countries, unfettered trade in which the government gets out of the economy and reduces regulations, is economically more efficient, and that all countries will send their own products that they make most efficiently back and forth, and everybody will win. But the studies in Mexico are mixed, and they oftentimes show that what really takes place is that farms in Mexico are asked to stop farming to eat and instead to create an agricultural system in which crops are exported, and that oftentimes puts people out of business, and they, in many cases, move to Mexico City and then go one step further and move to the borders where they live in and around towns that are right on the U.S. border, and they work in maquiladoras. And maquiladoras are factories which produce items for a cheaper wage or a cheaper price than they would be produced in the United States, and those products are sent right back across the U.S. border. Now, maquiladoras and NAFTA in the larger picture have been very controversial. The idea behind neoliberal economic reform is that competitive advantage will draw business to Latin America. What that means, however, is that U.S. corporations and companies, for example, would like to produce things cheaply, and the competitive advantage of Mexico in this case is that they can produce things cheaply, partly because they pay people less. There are less environmental laws, there are less labor assurances and labor laws, and you can look at this as a positive thing if you believe in neoliberal economic reform, and that this will help Mexico have a market and produce goods that can go onto the world market and produce income and have foreign investment. But you can look at it from a negative perspective as well, which is that they're only going to Mexico because they pay less and they don't have to follow as many laws, or that laws are not as enforced as they might be in a place like the United States. So there are different ways that you can view this, but as a net total, we do know that NAFTA at times has created immigration and has moved people around the country, and in some cases leaving agriculture or going to border towns to get to maquiladoras, and then eventually taking that final step into moving into the United States. So there is a relationship between NAFTA and immigration.